Okay. Um, Ken, I think looking back over the last 10 years or so, that my sense is that the Scottish Government have been really good in maintaining a commitment to an affordable housing programme, and an affordable housing programme that's not just about low-cost home ownership, but has been about community and social housing. And I think that in an international environment where that's true in very few places, that they have to take a lot of credit for that. And I also think that they have to take credit, and are quite brave in saying they want to talk about a housing future to 2040. And given the fact that houses are fixed capital investments, they're designed, they're located in space, they're embedded in the ground. It's quite important to take that long-term view, but it's also really difficult. So I start by saying I think the general commitment to policy has been strong. I'm not quite sure about some of the operational details, and perhaps we can explore that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the commitment to an affordable social housing supply programme, which we anticipate a third of those, should the current government stay in power after next year's election, is really impressive and leads the rest of the UK. They have led the UK in that sense. And I think that's also true of the new tenancy arrangements in the private rented sector and the regulatory changes that have happened there. I guess, as you say, there are one or two things that haven't been as perhaps as successful. I don't think rent pressure zones have worked, and I think there are some issues about land and building transactions taxes, the Scottish stamp duty, that we might come back to and talk about later on. But I think, yeah, I agree, and I think the long-term perspective is absolutely
right. I think that looking at the longer term, that the perspective that seems to have been taken, and although there are a lot of good ideas emerging, like I do like the commitment to looking towards a much lower rate of house price inflation and stopping housing being a speculative asset. Housing is always important as a potential route for savings and so on in the longer term, but actually its role as a speculative asset has changed the distribution of income and wealth perversely. It's probably lowered productivity. I mean, why would any nation that wanted to shape an entrepreneurial future encourage people to invest their money in existing bricks and mortar? That doesn't actually make sense. And of course, it doesn't add to economic stability in the longer term to have high house prices, high debts, and of course, pressures on affordability. So I think they're right to actually put that as a long-term objective, and it's a tough one. And we need to begin to be talking about how we'll get there. I think that in terms of looking at the future, that we still tend to use demography as a kind of handrail to stumble into the future, because we can make population projections that are credible. And I don't think the economic analysis or projection forward is very strong. And that's partly because it's almost impossible to make that. I would actually think that the Scottish Government have used the missions approach, in the investment bank, in other areas of policy thinking. I think it's a natural to apply to the question of housing, both at a national level, but more importantly, at regional partnership, big local authority level, of articulating what are we trying to do here in terms of big objectives and connecting it to the big goals, but also evaluating and tracking and monitoring and understanding what's happening in the housing system is in a way much more important than extrapolating out a change that is not really credible over 25, 30 years. So I think that they could actually reframe their thinking about the future in a missions approach.
Yeah, and I strongly, I think, support the idea that we have a more local sort of framework in thinking about housing planning, and that rather than central government guiding and leading in the way that they do, and also presenting these very sort of core needs and demand estimates from a fairly formulaic approach, that we ought to return to giving local expertise and local understanding of markets their head, and really return to the older kind of world of local housing systems analysis, I guess, but really draw on that sense that local people really who are expert in their area are going to be able to they start from a really good position to understand their housing systems in a way that too kind of rigid a view of frameworks may lose. And I think that could be really quite important for particularly for trying to develop housing policies where we have those kind of missions, where we're trying to use the housing stock, for instance, to achieve retrofit goals or things like that. These are really challenging, demanding things. And I would have thought that a really close understanding of the local housing market and the housing structure is really important.
I would agree with you on that. I think that centralising local housing system analysis and forecasting to Victoria Quay is essentially a bad idea. And it's a bad idea. I was one of the people that was involved in actually setting up local housing system analysis. And part of that was about getting local authorities or collections of local authorities to take the market sector and thinking forward seriously. Now, cutting back thinking and analytical capacity at sub-Scottish level, down at level of, say, the Edinburgh City Region or Glasgow or whatever, that's a really bad mistake in terms of strategic thinking and planning. And I hope the Scottish Government think again about that particular change. And in the way that you use that for forecasting, people have different views, but I actually don't believe most of the forecasts that come out of it, but I still think it's really important to analyse the local housing system. And within that, I think there needs to be a much clearer articulation of the logic chains between what connects housing investment or housing cost changes to inclusion and inclusive growth, to growth and productivity. And I have to say that Scottish thinking on housing policy has almost always been completely devoid of any economic analysis or of impacts on the economy. And I think that's still true relative to the other places I work in, and it should change. But they also really need to articulate connections to the sustainability agenda. And I think that's going to be really important. Yeah,
and I think all of these things linked to the national performance framework and the way it's evolved in recent times. And I must say, in the work that we've been doing recently about retrofitting the existing stock, you just get really struck by not just the importance and the opportunity that this offers, but there's so much work to be done to design, deliver, work out the different ways of funding and implementing incentive compatible ways of addressing the different kinds of owners of the housing stock and the different tenures, etc. And that is a particularly big challenge because time is so short now in order to achieve these sorts of goals. And in a sense, what's being suggested is that almost from not quite a standing start, but there's an attempt to create an industry, to encourage the construction sector to take up that role, to generate the mechanisms by which this requisite skills can be developed. And clearly there's going to be a lot of people looking for work, and this is a great opportunity to direct people into the retrofit sector. But I know from talking to people in the sector that there is a worry that there's almost like there's a kind of chicken and egg problem about when the construction sector itself will embrace the retrofit opportunity, and that's when training opportunities come, the jobs grow, and that's when it grows to scale. And I know clearly there's now a lot of action happening in this sector, and BAYS and other government initiatives are taking place which are going to grow and strengthen this. But that there is a sense that they're creating something new, and that's a really challenging thing to do, but it's a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. And both in housing policy terms and employment and the economy, it's going to be first mover advantage that will be a real benefit to Scotland. And again, I think the Scottish Government have been to their credit, to the forefront of embracing, the sustainable development agenda. So hopefully that shows in better housing policies. In terms of taking forward these ideas about forecasting and investment strategies and so on, I actually, without in any way diminishing the social and environmental importance of housing outcomes, I actually think it's important to see housing as infrastructure, and actually to see that in a fairly full and forceful way, possibly somewhat stronger than the Scottish Infrastructure Commission did. And I think that what we should have is at the level of city regions or rural regions or whatever, sitting beside the economic partnerships or South of Scotland Enterprise or Highlands and Islands Enterprise, we really need regional infrastructure partnerships. And within that, there has to be a strong housing element. And I think in a way that the governance arrangement of that, thinking about strategy, has to much more explicitly include the non-profit sector and the private sector, as well as local authorities. If you look at the Edinburgh City deal, for instance, I think it's done a pretty good job in engaging multiple sectors in discussion about housing. I don't personally think that's the case for the Glasgow City region deal. And I don't think it's imparted a dynamic to the discussion about housing in a kind of, given we're in a world now where every sector has to pull together to deal with the not just COVID consequences, but the underlying prior problems, but it's going to do so in a fiscally stripped down context. I do think that that has to be represented in the governance structures and much more effective interactions involved in that. So I think that you're right about these multiple objectives and doing them at more local scales, but I think we need to look at the way we do governance to drive that forward.
Yeah, it's interesting that the governance or the kind of functional housing market, in a sense, which these regional partnerships can be expressed in those terms, it also kind of speaks to the credible way in which providers in making cases for resources, when clearly there's going to be, really, as you say, because of the fiscal state, there's going to be really strong competition for funds at the margin, that being able to demonstrate impact becomes really, really important. And we've been doing this work in the last year with HACT about the various multitudes of impacts, economic, social, well-being, etc., that housing providers can start to actually draw on evidence, credible evidence that the authors of the Green Book would support to an extent, where you use, monetized measures of well-being and such like. And what I find interesting about that is the way that can fit into a broader package of things, where you can use that kind of evidence to create better bids for public funds, clearly in an appraisal sense. You can use that kind of thinking to actually generate better local strategies, where you're thinking about where's the highest value, where's the highest social return for investments in a community, ways of measuring these things. And the other thing that it does is it allows for more rigorous evaluation after the fact, to see whether you're actually what were the outcomes of these interventions. And we saw in the spending review the other day that, following the kind of thing that American federal government does, that the UK government seems to be now getting more serious about evaluation of new interventions. And I actually think there's a lot we could do in housing to actually be a part of that and use evidence and generate an attitude towards evidence, which could be really constructive.
I think that's absolutely right, and it does kind of an unscripted comment would be that the diverse housing outcomes we've talked about, environmental, economic, social, the importance of issues about well-being, which involves quite often non-market outcomes. I have a bit of skepticism about the evaluation strategies that there are in the Green Book. And we know they've been recently changed in relation to infrastructure to help the question of investment in infrastructure, presumably in the north of England, but might help us. I think it would be interesting to explore what an evolving Green Book would look like in relation to housing decisions. I spent 5 years of my life as chief economist in the Federal Department for Infrastructure in Canada, where we spent $15 billion a year. And I have to say, I'm a lot more skeptical about the Green Book than most people I meet. So I think that it's important that we take that forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to write a chapter for the book that we're involved in at the moment, which is about these very issues, about using these appraisal techniques, not just in Britain but elsewhere, and the paradox that we make all these arguments that housing has these strong benefits attached to infrastructure and social benefits and multipliers and GVA and everything, but it doesn't seem to do very well out of these appraisal methodologies. And I know there's other political economy reasons for that as well beyond that, but we shouldn't stray too far off piste, I suppose. I think we're going to talk about affordability and this tension between flexible market responses and controls, aren't we?
I think regardless of what governance or evaluation frameworks, I think that high housing costs in relation to incomes are going to be the central problem going forward. And that's true for renters, and it's most acute for low-income households living in the private rented sector. I mean, the rent income burdens are now very huge and really need some substantial action. But it's true also for homeowners, at least those trying to get into the sector, so that they're at the crux of all of this. And I think that there's two broad philosophical approaches in policy here. One is a controlling one, where you say, let's have rent controls, let's stop rents rising, and there's a flexible one where it's about increasing supply. I think the policy rhetoric in Scotland is increasingly about controlling, and I think that has a big downside, is because it's dealing with a symptom rather than dealing with a problem. I do think that there's a case for what we call second generation rent controls, which restrict the rate of return or hiking rents whilst people are, in tenancies or within particular times, or when tenancies are effectively controlled. You can design some of these, but the discussion in Scotland's not been very explicit about which ones will work. And I think that's a bad idea. I also think that it's been accompanied with a kind of almost anti-growth view about investment in rented housing through constraining Airbnb, which I don't think works well in tenement structures. But in the context in which I think that there's a failure to recognise that we've had a growing private rented sector because government at a national level has not supported home ownership enough to achieve home ownership targets. And at the other end of the income scale, there's not been enough investment in social rented housing. So that to some extent, trying to solve the problem by rent controls on existing private landlords will not solve the problem. It will further reduce supply and make issues worse. And whilst I think that there's a temporary role for controls, the focus has to be on increasing the supply of housing. And when we get to that in Scotland, this is not about, I think, dilatory planning or whatever. I think it's about landholding and land ownership, and the extraction of economic rents when people come to sell land into residential development or whatever. I would like to see two things. I would like to see some extraction of uplift gains beyond allow some uplift gain, but restrict the overall amount. But I also think we should have a land tax. I would introduce a land tax to replace stamp duty, and I would also reallocate the resources raised to local authorities to actually deal with the issues that there are about growth and decline. Now, the Scottish Government won't like that because at the moment, stamp duty accrues to Scottish Government and not local authorities. Local authorities are underfunded for their housing and other tasks. And I think that a land tax would reduce some of their problems and raise some of their revenues.
I'll make two responses to that, Duncan, since you've covered quite a lot of ground there. The first is we've been doing an international evidence review in rent controls, which is not quite finished yet, but really, really interesting. Looking at the last 20 years, really going back to the Turner and Malpezzi paper from 2003 and really taking the work on from there. And it's really interesting, some really interesting pieces of analysis, much of course from North America, and that's one of the problems. There isn't British evidence to look at. We must look internationally at the impacts of rent controls since the late 1980s. So what that seems to me to suggest is that there's in principle, it's quite, as you say, it's quite conceivable that some kind of rent limitation, second generation rent control could both help people who are struggling to pay their rents in terms of their security of their tenancy, because they can actually have some predictability about where their rents are going to go in future, which they currently don't have. And secondly, I think it can be done in such a way that it doesn't necessarily have an overly negative impact on landlords, but it critically depends on how it's designed. As you say, it's absolutely about the really road testing and designing something carefully, and that's quite another matter. There's no guarantee that it's going to be designed well. Secondly, I completely agree about this opportunity in a sense that exists to do something much more efficient and progressive about taxation. I think lots of economists are obviously opposed to transactions taxes. The Murley's review was really clear about stamp duty, that abolishing it, etc. And they kind of argued along similar lines to a land value tax would be at the margin, of course, have a much lower impact than any transactions tax because it's spread across the entire nation. It affects every single land holding, every property in the country. So that's quite a different proposition. And I think it should replace that tax. So there'd be all those benefits that we get from a land value tax. And then in the longer term, potentially it could be part of the shifting of the overall tax base to fixed factors of production and give us opportunities to protect those variable ones like labour and income tax, etc. But I also would like to see local government have greater financial freedom. I think it's really, really important to local governance that they have that freedom. And I would want to reform the council tax, going back to the earlier commission in the middle of the last decade. So I would maybe be, if that was all possible, I would be more relaxed to think about the land value tax, most of it returning to central government. At the end of the day, it's all got to raise revenue, and if local government is using that revenue, it's the same pot of revenue that we need for our public services, isn't it? So that's almost a second order question, maybe where it sits with. But yeah, so that I think we're in furious agreement here, actually.
Well, I'm not sure everyone else will be in furious agreement with us, Ken, but let's stand together on this one.
Exactly.
A couple of things. I did some work for Husbanken, the Norwegian, basically the fund based on oil wealth, looking at rent and rent controls in Europe. And what struck me was when economists look at rented sectors, we tend to look at the effect of controls and assume that that's what's driving change. I reached a rather different conclusion, which was what had really happened since 2000 was that all the demand side groups had changed. In other words, there was increased demand for rental housing because of changes in age profiles, in entry to home ownership, in mobilities, international and domestic. In other words, the rental sector is always made up of 7 or 8 different segments, and demand growth had happened in all of them. And I think that's the problem. And if you do a controlling exercise, you have to think of, well, just restricting that demand growth because you've restricted the supply side, damage economic, social, or other objectives. And I think in the Scottish case, it probably will if we don't think about it. What I do think, and on the point I was making earlier about looking at flexibilities, and I recognise that if you're going to provide decent housing for low-income households, you've got to deeply subsidise it, and it's quite often not best delivered via the market. It's best via delivered through non-profits or whatever. But in the context of COVID, we are seeing changes. I think COVID has a number of implications. It's a shock to the system. It's an economic shock. We're going to have a really difficult economy over the next couple of years and dealing with that. There'll be housing market consequences of that. I think there'll be potentially homeless younger people who've previously been employed who are not going to be employed. I think there'll be impacts on demand for housing that come because interest rates are really low. Will it be people of my age who've got equity are able to borrow at more or less zero interest rates to buy assets and let them to younger people again? You know, that so that there is that potential effect. There's also the question about structural changes in what people want. In other words, some people are saying, we don't need to come to work every day. We can do this online. So I don't need to go to the office. I can live further out as long as it's a well-connected rural area or small town or even suburban edge. So there's some preliminary evidence that's starting to shift the market. But we also know that the demand for larger flats is holding up better in the cities than smaller flats because people, if they're going to be locked down, they need that bit more space if they're going to live at home and not go crazy. And there's, of course, your colleagues in Cash have been looking at the changing use and meaning of the home. And there's also the question about the services that there are around about. So I do think that COVID it's a shock. I think it lays bare the inequalities that we have because the worst impacts have been in the poorest neighbourhoods, but it also changes the structure of the housing market. But once we do that, we're still back to the fundamentals about concentrated poverty and high housing costs relative to incomes.
No, that's absolutely right. I think perhaps one of the questions for our panel will be whether these emerging impacts on the structure of the market and prices and rents and demands and locational preferences, etc., whether that's a short-term response or whether it's actually going to be a more permanent kind of outcome, which we probably can speculate on, I suppose. But I completely agree that it's laid bare and it's cast a rather unflattering light on a lot of the inequalities and the problems with the housing stock and a lot of other things that shows the kind of fragility of the housing system to some extent, perhaps, that it's not resilient as one might want. And yeah, I'm just thinking back to what you said about the private rented sector. It sounds actually that policy needs to better think systematically about the segments of the rental market that are in the terms you've used before elsewhere. They're like product groups and they're kind of consumer demand groups, and they are quite distinct, and policy will be more or less effective in particular combinations of those things. But there's a real danger of it being too broad and having impacts in the wrong places, and obviously these things interact as well, you know. So I think that's a real challenge when the sector's now, you know, 15% plus of the whole housing system. So are we about done? Have we covered the terrain, do you think?
Yeah, I put on my Ronnie Barker glasses so I can say, and it's good night from him.
Good, and it's good night from me.